She's sitting in the passenger seat, window halfway down. It's a Friday night in Studio City. Restaurant behind her, street light above. Her husband went back inside to get something he forgot. She's waiting. She doesn't know how long she's been waiting. And then someone walks up to the passenger side of the car. She can't run. She's already in the seat. 2 shots, one to the head, one to the shoulder. Her husband comes back out a few minutes later, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because what he does next, what he doesn't do, is something I've been turning over in my head for a long time. Hey, so this case has been sitting on my list for a while now. I keep coming back to it because it doesn't resolve cleanly. The jury came back not guilty. The civil jury came back liable. The murder is still officially unsolved. 24 years later, and somewhere in the middle of all that, there's a woman named Bonny and a little girl named Rose who was 11 months old when her mother died in that car on a Friday night in May. Okay, so let's start with Bonny, because I think she gets flattened. Every time this case gets covered, she becomes the con artist, the grifter, the woman who scammed men. And yeah, that's true, but that's not all she was. And it's definitely not why she died. Bonny Lee Bakley was born June 7th, 1956, in Morristown, New Jersey. She grew up with her grandmother, not her parents, her grandmother. Her mother ran an antique business. Her father was an alcoholic. She was raised by and with her grandmother in a small town called Glen Gardner, New Jersey. She was bullied in school. She dropped out at 16, moved to New York City to try to become an actress, a model. She wanted to be someone. That's the thing about Bonny. She spent her whole life trying to become someone people would notice. The acting didn't work out. The modeling didn't work out. So she found another way. She started running Lonely Hearts ads in the back of magazines. Different names, different stories. Julia, the nursing student who needed tuition money. Someone else who needed rent. Men would respond and send cash. Sometimes she'd show up like she promised. Most times, she didn't. She made enough to buy a few houses in Memphis. She had 4 kids from different men. She'd been married 9 times before she ever met Robert Blake. One of those marriages lasted 1 day. Her longest was 5 years, to her first cousin. And somewhere underneath all of that, underneath all the scams and the fake names and the marriages, was someone who genuinely wanted what a lot of people want: to matter, to be chosen, to belong. A friend of hers who knew her for over 15 years said the thing she really wanted was to be married to a celebrity and have a child with them. That would make her feel special. And she finally got that dream. That's the thing about Bonny. She got exactly what she wanted, and it got her killed. Now, here's a detail I want you to hold on to. When Rose was born in June of 2000, Bonny didn't name her Rose. She named her Christian Shannon Brando because she thought someone else was the father. File that away. We'll come back to it. So where does Robert Blake come into this? 1999. He's 65 years old. She's 42. They meet at a jazz club in Hollywood. And I want to tell you who Blake was before I tell you what he did, because I think it matters. Robert Blake was born Michael James, Gubitosi in Huntley, New Jersey, September 18th, 1933. His parents were Italian immigrants who put together a song and dance act. By the time he was 6, he was performing with them. By the time he was 8, he was in MGM's Our Gang, the Little Rascals. He was working, bringing in money, making the family look good in front of the camera. And behind the camera, his father was an alcoholic who beat him, locked him in closets, and forced him to eat off the floor. His mother was there for all of it. Blake later said both parents abused him in every way you can abuse a child. He told Entertainment Weekly, "Our cemeteries and jails and death rows and drunk tanks are filled with people like me. I don't know why I survived." He ran away at 14, on his own from that point on. And here's the thing, he got his first hug at 8 years old. Not from his parents, from his co-star on a movie set. An actress named Donna Reed wrapped her arms around him during the filming of Moki in 1942. He was 8 years old. That was the first time. I think about that a lot, because when someone learns that early, that love comes from performance, not from just being there, not from just being a kid that shapes something that doesn't go away easy. He went into the army at 19, came out, couldn't find work, spent years using and selling cocaine and heroin, suicidal thoughts, went to psychiatrists, tried to put himself back together. And he did, in a sense. He got the acting jobs back. 1967, in Cold Blood. He plays Perry Smith, a killer. He said later the role worked because he knew that darkness. 1975, Baretta. Tony Baretta, Street Cop, Cockatoo, Emmy Award. 1976, biggest thing he ever had. And then in 78 it ends. Show gets canceled. For the next 20 years, he pops up here and there. Nothing sticks. He marries in 61. Divorces in 83. 2 kids, Noah, Delina. His first wife, Sandra, later said he was obsessively jealous, that he threatened her, that she was terrified of him, that he got full custody, and she couldn't say exactly how. And that's the thing about Blake. People who knew him from the outside said he was charming, generous, funny. The neighbor said he was a nice guy. But the people who got close, who couldn't leave, they described someone else entirely. Because here's what I think happened. Blake grew up in a house where the person with the most power controlled everyone else through fear. That's what he learned love looked like. Not warmth, not safety, control. And when he had fame, when the world was giving him what he wanted without him having to force it, that worked fine. But fame doesn't last. And by 1999, Robert Blake is 65 years old, 20 years out of the spotlight, and he walks into a jazz club and meets a woman who is very good at getting what she wants. And neither of them is going to bend for the other. So, Bonny gets pregnant. She tells both Blake and Christian Brando, Marlon Brando's son, that each of them is the father. Blake demands a paternity test. Test comes back. It's his. He agrees to marry her, but only on his terms. He draws up a custody agreement and a prenuptial agreement. Bonny's own lawyer looks at it and refuses to sign off. He testifies later at trial, in my career, I have never seen an agreement like this that is as abusive and controlling as this. So Bonny finds a different lawyer, one who works for Blake, and signs it. Under the terms, she can only see Rose under supervision. She needs written permission for her own family to visit Blake's property. And if either of them tries to end the marriage, the other keeps Rose. Her attorney told her, they are setting up a condition for you to lose custody of your child. She signed anyway, because she wanted to marry a celebrity more than anything else. They get married November 19th, 2000, but they don't live together. Bonny and Rose are in the guest house, behind Blake's main residence in Studio City, not in the house. In the back, separate, under watch, Blake hires a private investigator to monitor his own wife, finds out she's still running her scams, finds out she never stopped, and here's the part nobody has been able to fully explain. In the months before Bonny died, Robert Blake made 56 phone calls to a stuntman named Ronald Hambleton, 3 calls to another stuntman, Gary McLarty, using a prepaid phone card he bought specifically for those calls. That card was used to call those 2 men and nobody else. Not his lawyer, not his friends, not his daughter, nobody else. Just those 2 men, 56 times. On a card that couldn't be traced back to his regular phone bill. Both men would later tell police that Blake asked them to kill Bonny. One said Blake drove him to a location in the desert and suggested that's where it could happen, that the bodyguard would dig the holes. Another said Blake suggested it Could happen right behind Vitello's, the restaurant where they'd eat dinner. Blake even showed one of them a gun he said was untraceable. A 25 caliber. Wait, hold on. Because the defense had a response to all of this, and it's not nothing. Ronald Hambleton, the guy Blake called, 56 times told investigators that police were tunneling under his house, that spies were disguised as bushes outside his window, that little horned animals were coming after him. Gary McLarty, the other stuntman, ended up in a psychiatric hospital after crawling through a desert on his hands and knees. These were the prosecution's 2-star witnesses. The jury saw them, heard them, and walked Blake out the door. But here's what the jury didn't need to decide, and what I keep coming back to: why did Blake call those men 56 times on a card he used for nothing else? You don't have to answer that. Just sit with it for a second. Okay, so May 4th, 2001, Friday night. Blake and Bonny drive to Vitello's, his favorite Italian restaurant in Studio City. He's been going there for years. Everyone knows him. He parks the car himself, never uses the valet. Parks the black Dodge Stealth around the corner on a side street, behind a dumpster, next to a construction site. Not in the parking lot, not under a light, behind a dumpster. Before they even sit down for dinner, a witness sees Blake in the men's room, pulling at his hair, mumbling to himself, vomiting into the trash can. When he walks out, he looks shaky, agitated. Not right. This is before the meal. They eat. They have pasta. Blake pays the bill at 9:23. In the evening, using his credit card. They walk out together. Bonny gets in the passenger seat, window halfway down, and then Blake says he has to go back. He forgot his gun inside, his Smith & Wesson .38. Left it in the booth. Okay, so I need you to think about this for a second. Blake carried that gun everywhere because he was afraid for his safety. Afraid enough to bring it to a dinner at his favorite restaurant. But then he leaves his wife alone in a parked car on a dark side street to go get the gun. The gun that was supposed to protect them, he leaves her to go get it. If you were genuinely scared, wouldn't you take her with you? Or park right in front of the restaurant where there are people? Anyway, Blake goes back inside. Here's what a busboy at Vitello's told the police afterward. He had already cleared their table. Before Blake came back in, cleared it. No gun. Nobody at the restaurant remembered seeing Blake return. Given where the booth was, people would have noticed. So Blake, according to his story, gets the gun, comes back outside, and finds Bonny shot twice in the passenger seat of their car. What does he do? He does not go to her. He runs to the house across the street, pounds on the door, rings the bell, tells the man inside, his name was Sean Stanek, that his wife was beaten up. Needs help? Call 911. Stanek goes to the car. Bonny is still alive. Barely. Stanek holds a hint. He said later there was a massive amount of blood. Blake runs back to the restaurant to find a doctor. A nurse comes back with him, and here's what 3 witnesses said they saw when Blake returned. He sat down on the curb. He did not go near Bonny. He screamed, "My wife! My wife!" loud enough for everyone to hear, but one witness said he appeared to be turning it on and off, like a switch. He vomited on the street. He cried, but witnesses said there were no tears. Bonny was taken to the hospital. She died at 10:15 that night. She was 44 years old. She was a mother of 4 children. And somewhere in Studio City, in a guest house behind Blake's home, an 11-month-old girl named Rose was asleep, not knowing anything yet. Now, the murder weapon, this is the part that gets strange in a very specific way. The gun Blake said he left in the booth. His Smith & Wesson .38, police test it. Not the murder weapon. The actual murder weapon was found 3 days later in a dumpster, a block and a half from the car, a Walther PPK. Small. concealable, covered in oil and dirt, no fingerprints, a collector's item, a vintage German pistol from World War II. 3 bullets still inside, 2 had been fired. And then the serial number, it had been filed off. Whoever had this gun did not want it traced back to them. The FBI examined it. They managed to partially read the number, traced it as far as they could. Dead end. A gun show. No paperwork, no record of the sale, could have ended up in anyone's hands. They could never link that gun to Robert Blake or to anyone else. And that right there, that is the hole this whole case falls into. And then they found this. Police search Blake's bodyguard. Earl Caldwell arrest him on conspiracy charges. Search his house. They find another old German pistol, a broom handle Mauser, and a handwritten list, items on the list. Shovels, a sledgehammer, duct tape, lye, pool acid, Drano, and the notation, get blank gun ready. I'm serious. That list was real. It was entered into evidence. Caldwell had an explanation for everything on it. Police eventually decided he wasn't involved and dropped his charges. But just think about that list for a second. Shovels, lye, get blank gun ready. In the home of Blake's bodyguard, police tested Blake's hands for gunshot residue. 2.5 hours after the shooting, they found traces. Not a lot. A forensics expert said if he'd fired the gun, even after washing his hands, there should have been significantly more. The defense said the residue could have come from other guns. Blake kept it home. No blood spatter on Blake either, but there was none on the car door. So whoever did this wasn't covered in it regardless. In April of 2002, almost a year after the murder, LAPD arrests Robert Blake. Murder, 2 counts of solicitation. Conspiracy, special circumstance of lying in wait. LAPD Captain Jim Tatro stands at a press conference and says, Robert Blake had contempt for Bonny Bakley. He felt that he was trapped in a marriage he wanted no part of. Blake sits in jail for over a year, waiting for trial. In December 2004, 3.5 years after Bonny died, the trial finally begins. It lasts 4 months. The prosecution lays out their theory. Blake wanted the baby, not the wife. He tried to get Bonny to have an abortion before Rose was born. When that didn't work, he started looking for other options. A private investigator, Blake, hired a former police detective named William Welch, gets on the stand and testifies. Blake proposed kidnapping Bonny, forcing her to have an abortion. And if that didn't work, whack her. Welch said he told Blake, "Are you out of your mind?" And that Blake called him the next morning and said he'd changed his mind. Welch believed him, did not call the police, did not tell anyone, just moved on. And I think about that a lot because the warnings were there. Bonny's own mother told reporters her daughter feared Blake might one day follow through on his threats. Bonny's half-brother remembered a conversation where Bonny said, "If anything happens to me, it's Blake." Bonny's own attorney called the custody agreement a setup for disaster for her right to her face, and she still signed it. A former detective heard Blake say whack her and decided he'd talked him out of it. Did not call the police. All of those people knew something was wrong, really wrong, and not one of them did enough to change it. That's not me judging them. That's just what the record shows. March 16th, 2005, the verdict comes in. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of 1 count of solicitation. The jury deadlocked 11-1 on the second solicitation count, 11 in favor of acquittal. That charge gets dropped. The DA, Steve Cooley, goes in front of cameras afterward and calls Blake a miserable human being, calls the jurors incredibly stupid. The jurors respond, the prosecution just didn't prove it. No physical evidence tied Blake to the gun. No witnesses. 2 star witnesses who believed horned animals or chasing them through the desert. And the jury made a legal call. 8 months later, November 2005, civil trial. Different standard, not beyond reasonable doubt. Just more likely than not, the jury finds Blake liable. $30 million to Bonny's children. Blake files for bankruptcy before the verdict even comes down. Appeals court cuts the $30 million to $15 million. The parties eventually settle for an undisclosed amount. Blake walks out of all of it, technically a free man, broken, bankrupt, infamous, but free. And here's what most videos don't tell you about what came after. Blake largely disappears, keeps a low profile for years. In 2012, he gives an interview to Piers Morgan on CNN. He calls Bonny a con artist, says, "I didn't know her well enough to know her." That's his public statement about his wife, the woman who is the mother of his youngest daughter. In 2017, he marries again, a third time, divorces in 2018, 1 year. In 2019, he starts a YouTube channel, titles it, "I Ain't Dead Yet, So Stay Tuned." Posts videos about his life. Also in 2019, someone else starts talking. Rose Lenore Sophia Blake, 19 years old. She gives her first interview to People magazine, to Good Morning America, to Inside Edition. And what she says stops me cold. She says, "It's hard when everyone talks about you and you're not talking about yourself. I am now." She grew up in Sherman Oaks, California, with her half-sister Delina, Blake's daughter from his first marriage, who legally adopted her in 2002. The year after Bonny died, she called Delina Mom and Dad's husband. Dad, they were her family. But she grew up with depression, anxiety. She says it kind of was a traumatic childhood at that point. When she was in high school, a cheerleader at a football game, she noticed a man in the stands taking photos of her. A few weeks later, the photos were in a tabloid magazine. She said it put distance between her and her classmates that never fully closed. She didn't visit her mother's grave until she was 18. Didn't know exactly where it was for years. Didn't look it up. Said, "I just don't think I was ready." When she finally went, she was 18, alone, standing at a simple headstone that reads, "Bonny Lee Bakley Blake, in loving memory. Rest in peace." That same year, she reached out to Blake for the first time since she was 5 years old. She said the first meeting was overwhelming, a lot to take in. She calls him Robert, not Dad. When he offered to tell her what really happened that night, she said, "I specifically asked him not to tell me. I don't want to know. Not right now. I don't think I'm ready." She has no idea if he did it. She said, "I only know as much as everyone else knows." And of her mother, whose name has been dragged through every tabloid and true crime forum for decades. Rose said, "People have a lot of negative things to say about her, and that is really hard to hear. I choose to just focus on the good." Okay, so I want to step back for a second because this case doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a pattern here that shows up in other places. Other cases, and when you put them side by side, something becomes clearer. 2008, Colorado. A man named Chris Watts kills his pregnant wife, Shanann, and his 2 daughters, Bella, 4 years old, Celeste, 3 years old, buries them at his oil field, goes on television the next morning to ask the public to help find his missing family, cries in front of cameras. No tears. He wanted out of the marriage, wanted a new life with someone else, couldn't figure out how to leave without losing everything. So he didn't leave. He eliminated the problem. 1994, California, O.J. Simpson, former NFL star, TV personality, wife Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend Ron Goldman found at her home. Both gone. Simpson acquitted criminally, found liable in civil court, Sound familiar? Criminal, not guilty. Civil, liable. Murder, officially unsolved. There were years of documented reports before Nicole died. Police called to the house. Her own calls. Her own words. All of it in the record. Nobody stopped what was coming. 2002. England, Soham. A school caretaker named Ian Huntley. Two girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, both 10 years old. Both gone. Huntley had a documented history, multiple allegations before Soham. All of them missed. All of them not passed to the right people. After the case, a public inquiry found the system had failed at every level. Laws changed in the UK because of it. New background check systems. Because it turned out the warnings existed, they just weren't connected. Now, I'm not saying these cases are identical to Blake. They're not, but here's what they share. In every single one of them, the warnings came before the ending. In every single one of them, someone knew something was off. And in every single one of them, the gap between knowing and acting was wide enough for something irreversible to happen. And here's what I genuinely can't stop thinking about, because I think this is bigger than any one case. When a man has power, real power, money, fame, reputation, the people around him tend to give him the benefit of the doubt. Even when what he's saying is whack her, even when the list in his bodyguard's house has lie and shovels on it, even when his first wife couldn't say out loud what he did to her, even when his second wife told her mother she was scared because he was Robert Blake, not Robert whoever, Baretta, Emmy winner, 60 years in Hollywood, and that right there is how things get missed. Not because nobody saw, because everybody saw and then adjusted what they saw to fit who they thought he was. Here's what the record actually shows. Blake's lawyer at the custody hearing called the agreement the most abusive and controlling he had ever seen in his career. Not aggressive, not tough, abusive, controlling, those were his words. Under oath, Blake's own private investigator heard him say, whack her, and decided he was just venting. Did not call the police. Bonnie's own mother knew. Her half-brother knew. Her attorney knew. Nobody called the police. And on the other side, Blake's first wife, Sandra, testified in the civil case that in the mid-70s, when Baretta was at its peak, she was told Blake had put out a contract on her life, planned to frame it as a Manson killing. She didn't come forward until after Bonny was dead. I'm not saying I know what happened. On that street, on May 4th. I don't. Nobody does. That's the honest answer. The jury made a legal decision based on the evidence they had. And the evidence they had genuinely had holes in it. The stuntmen were not credible witnesses. That's real. The gun couldn't be traced to Blake. That's real. No blood, no fingerprints, no eyewitness. That's all real. But also real, 56 calls on a card used for nothing else. A busboy who cleared the table before Blake came back and found no gun. A man who heard whack her and didn't call the police. A woman who told people she was scared. A window halfway down on a dark side street. And a husband who came back to find his wife shot and sat on a curb and did not go near her. Both of those things are true. At the same time, the legal system said not guilty. The civil system said liable. The murder file says unsolved. And Bonny is still dead. Robert Blake died March 9th, 2023. Heart disease. 89 years old. He was not included in the in memoriam segment at the Oscars that year. The host mentioned the omission as a joke, and now I want to go back to something I mentioned early on. When Rose was born, Bonny named her Christian Shannon Brando because she was sure Blake wasn't the father. When the paternity test came back, Blake was the father. The baby's name was changed. Blake chose the new name, Rose. Just Rose. Rose Lenore Sophia Blake. 6 months later, Bonny was dead. Rose was 11 months old. At the funeral, Blake brought Rose with him, and the baby, 11 months old, reached down and grabbed a white rose from her mother's coffin. I don't know what to do with that. I really don't. Because that image, an 11-month-old girl named Rose pulling a white rose from her mother's coffin. That's not a metaphor. That actually happened. And then that little girl grew up without her mother. Grew up with the case on the internet forever. Grew up with her face in tabloids at football games. Grew up not visiting her mother's grave until she was 18 because she wasn't ready. Grew up calling her father Robert. And when she finally talked, she didn't talk about the case. She talked about her mother. She said, people have a lot of negative things to say about her. That is really hard to hear. I choose to just focus on the good. That's who Bonny Lee Bakley is, to the one person who has the most right to define her, not the scams, not the marriages, not the con artist, just the good, whatever that was, whatever Rose decided it was, on her own, in her own time, standing at a headstone in a cemetery when she was 18 years old and finally ready to say hello to her mother. Bonny Lee Bakley, born June 7th, 1956, died May 4th, 2001, 44 years old, mother of 4. Her murder is still unsolved.